There are several important takeaways from this report. The first one is that there are many companies, as we all know, that set environmental targets, but these are not aligned to a pathway to the 1.5 degree objective. At least three reasons for this: either because the companies, frankly, they don't really act upon them; it's only PR and communication, or because they're not using science-based methods of measuring, so they measure things that are not compatible to other measures, or most frequently because they don't take into account their end-to-end emissions, so their supply chain, so the scope 3. The BCG CDP data show that GHG, greenhouse gases emission, of a company's supply chain is 11 times, 1,100% more than their operational emissions, scope 1 and 2. Another takeaway is that there is hope. Corporate buyers have the ability to change what happened at the required scale and speed by influencing top-down their suppliers. And we can see this in the number of companies who participate in the BCG-CDP thing. Some companies have made it mandatory for their suppliers to participate in it, like L'Oreal, for instance, and several others. And some more others, they strongly incite their suppliers to participate. So in the last year we have data, so between 2020 and 2021, the number of requests to participate in CDP went from 16,000 to 23,000, so almost 50% up. One way of doing this is using the sustainable procurement pathway that BCG and CDP co-developed, that includes all aspects of our company, starting from strategy, people, processes, all the way to technology and communication, and puts them through a 5-steps process, very basic, foundation, development, implementation, enhancement, leadership. And each one has a very concrete number of steps and measurable KPIs and so on and so forth. And this is the way forward. Last important takeaway is that action is urgent, because as the CDP BCG report demonstrates, there is an important time lag between the moment a company decides to disclose data about emission, especially scope 3, the moment they create the mechanism required to collect all this data, the moment they use this data to measure their impact, and the moment they take action. This was one of the points. The BCG-CDP approach is already science-based, so there's a very scientific method of decomposing products and activities into their components and measure the scope 3 on each of them. And it also provides an holistic approach. It provides an approach that allows you to start and develop along the thing. It provides you KPIs and so on and so forth. So makes everything actionable and measurable, and thus actionable. This is definitely one of the takeaways. Of course, the number is an average, but
Correct.
On average, between scopes 1 and 2 and scopes 3, there is 11 times more emissions on scope 3 than it is on scope 1 and 2. There are no strong typical characteristics yet. Of course, if you look at the companies who report and they are active in this domain, they usually have an open and positive company culture towards environmental issues, and they have a top management that is sensitized to those issues. But if you look at the list of the companies who participate in CDPs, they cover all types of sectors and industries, from banks and financial companies to consumer packaged goods, from heavy B2B industries to light B2C industries, etc. So for now, there is not a typical profile of company who participates. As I said, it's a question of culture and willingness of the top management. Now, we see some leading indicators that will soon change this mix, because in some countries and in some industries, we start seeing increased shareholders' pressure, which reflects reputational risks. and in some countries also emerging regulation that which will also change all that. The answer is definitely yes. Going back to your electric vehicle example, there have been some attempts, but as far as I know, nobody has measured the end-to-end process yet, simply because it's extremely complex. And batteries are made in different ways, and the way the batteries are used is different, and there are different types of batteries, and so on and so forth. So, of course, not everything that comes up right now is necessarily better for the environment, for sustainability, but we start going to the right direction. Of course, we will, because all this is in a relatively early stage. But for instance, you mentioned methane. Methane, depending how you measure it, it's 20 to 25 times more, how to put it, noisable. It has a higher HTA, heat trapping ability, than CO2. That's the bad news about methane. The good news about methane is that it decomposes itself. It reacts with oxygen and it decomposes. So even without doing anything, the methane that there is in the atmosphere, if we leave it alone, in less than a century, it will disappear. CO2, on the other side, is, as I'm sure you know, it's an inert gas. So everything we produce will stay there forever unless we do proactively something to decrease it. Now, that's not a problem for the approach, because all GHGs, the greenhouse gases, are measured in CO2 equivalent. There is a way of transforming everything to CO2 equivalent. So this is a key step in prioritizing what actions need to be taken. We're using something that's called the global warming potential, which is a characteristic that applies to all sources of energy. And of course, each source has a different GWP. But by using this global warming potential, we have a way of transforming everything to the same unit so that we can compare and prioritize. I'm not sure we are on target, but these are probably, some of the right energy sources. None of this has been calculated ever end to end of how much it costs, but we know that wind, geothermal, hydro, solar have a smaller footprint, a smaller carbon footprint than fossil fuels, for instance. Then there are some other of the new fuels that come out, like biomass. Biomass is mainly wood or derivatives of wood. That under standard condition, actually, they produce more CO2 than fossil fuels. The difference is that, of course, biomass is renewable. You can still grow trees and continue burning them and so on and so forth, but it's not necessary. It's good for sustainability in the very wide sense of the word, but it's not good for the environment because it produces more CO2. Now, are we in the right path? Probably not, because of the time lag I mentioned before, going from the moment you decide to start collecting data and doing something about it until the moment you take action, there's a very large lag. It's measured in years. And as we see, at least now, the number of companies who start acting that does not increase more than 5% per year. So with that rhythm, it will take us 20 years until everybody starts doing something. And if it takes us 20 years until everybody starts doing something, we will largely overshoot our targets. So it's very important that action starts as soon as possible. Well, several points here. These two dates are, of course, arbitrary. We'll just pick them because we needed a round year. The targets that are associated with these two dates are, of course, related. If we miss the one, we might miss the other one. Why we need a short-term target and a slightly longer-term target? The short term we need because it's a call to action. As I said before, given the current rhythm of companies who start doing something, probably we're going to miss the 2030 target, which increases the probability of missing the 2050 target. The 2050 target exists with the hope, which probably, or at least hopefully, will realize that new technologies and new approaches will come up until then that will allow us new abatement strategies and approaches that will allow us new ways of producing with generating less CO2, CO2 equivalent, etc. But of course, something very important is that the 2050 target and the fact that new technologies may come one day and help achieving this target should not stop companies from acting now. Because as I said before, there's a clear correlation between targets of 2030 and 2050. So, if we start missing one, we might miss the other one as well. Yeah, I'm not sure we are talking of yet for disruption. We're talking about significant improvement of existing technologies, significant improvement of the way we use solar energy, significant improvement of the way we use wind energy, and especially significant improvement of how we store energy to get by the intermittence issue, which is of course an important issue in renewables energies. But for now, there is no clear disruptive path that has been identified. Arun, as I said, if I knew which technologies will come up in 20 years, I would probably not be here. And we were working on these technologies. No, in all the areas you mentioned, production of energy, aviation, and so on and so forth, we expect significant improvements. But then it depends on what is your definition of disruption. After what level of improvement it's disruptive or not. For now, nothing. Everything shows that we will continue decreasing the production, the energy consumption, and thus the production of CO2. But I don't think we can talk about disruption. There are a couple of areas, like for instance, capture of CO2, the way we can potentially capture it and store it, that might come up and might come up. They already exist, but they are not very practical, and especially they are not very economical. The business case has not been proven yet. And this might come up, but frankly, I cannot predict what will come up in 20 years. No, what's happening is the following, that the boards and the shareholders, at least in some companies, themselves start becoming really aware of the danger and of the problem that the climate crisis and climate change has to do. But also their clients, their customers become increasingly sensitized in that. And if you see what are the companies that are the more active and they took the more, the more stringent measures, the more actionable measures, among them you find companies like Unilever, for instance, which of course it's a B2C company, or at least B2B2C company, and it's extremely sensitive to what their consumers think. So it will be a mixture of regulation, a mixture of shareholders, institutional shareholders, change of point of view, but also it will be also the fact that we take more and more into account what the final consumer has to do. Look what happened when BP announced, British Petroleum announced their own plan, which was very, very, it a bit lacked substance, and it was a bit generic and so on and so forth. And in the same day, and in the weeks after that, they got a lot of criticism, public criticism, and run a significant reputational risk. So, shareholders start being very sensitive to all this, but also they have their own sensitivity to the fact that, we're destroying the planet. But technology starts not becoming an issue, and the CO2 AI, the instrument that BCG developed and that CDP is using, is one of the instruments. There are many others out there that help companies overcome this kind of problems. Because of course it's very complicated analyzing your entire supply chain, which your assortment might have 100,000 SKUs coming from 10,000 different suppliers. It's using a plethora of parts. You can imagine trying to calculate the CO2 equivalent of all this. It's obviously that you need advanced technology, and the way we are doing it at BCG is with artificial intelligence. But the tools start existing. So the fact that some companies are not sufficiently technological advanced is not an excuse anymore.